Imagine a world where knowledge was a treasure locked away in dusty monasteries, guarded like gold, and accessible only to a chosen few. This was Europe before the printing press. Books were not simply rare, they were luxuries, painstakingly copied by hand on parchment, a process so slow that a single book could take years to complete. The result was a society where the vast majority of people never saw a book in their entire lives. Literacy was reserved for priests, monks, scholars, and the wealthy elite. For ordinary people, stories were passed by word of mouth, myths were preserved in memory, and truth was whatever the authorities said it was. If you wanted to learn, you had to find a teacher who had access to a book, and even then, the odds were slim. Imagine living in a time where even kings and queens could count the number of books they owned on their fingers. Knowledge was not just scarce, it was imprisoned. This scarcity shaped everything. It limited the way people thought, the way societies developed, and the speed at which ideas could travel. Entire generations could live and die without ever encountering new knowledge beyond their village or church sermon. This is the backdrop of the world in the early 1400s. A world hungry for knowledge but starved of access. It was a world waiting for a spark, and that spark would come from a man named Johannes Gutenberg. Johannes Gutenberg was not born into wealth or power. He was a craftsman, a tinkerer, a man obsessed with solving problems. In the 1430s and 1440s, he began experimenting with an idea that would seem simple to us today, but in his time, it was revolutionary. He combined several existing technologies, the wine press, movable metal type, and oil-based ink, into a machine that could print books with speed and precision. This was not an overnight success. Gutenberg struggled with financing, legal battles, and skepticism. At one point, he even lost control of his workshop to investors who doubted him. But his persistence paid off. What he created was nothing less than the machine that would set humanity free from the chains of ignorance. The genius of the printing press was not just in its design, but in its scalability. For the first time in human history, a single page could be reproduced hundreds of times in the same day. What once took months could now be done in hours. The speed, the efficiency, the sheer potential was staggering. Gutenberg himself might not have fully realized it, but what he invented would trigger a cultural earthquake that reshaped civilization. And the first great tremor of that earthquake was the printing of a book that would change religion forever, the Bible. Around 1455, Gutenberg completed his masterpiece, the 42-line Bible. It was elegant, precise, and breathtaking in its quality. Unlike handwritten manuscripts, each copy looked identical, with crisp letters and uniform spacing. The beauty of the text itself reflected the beauty of the invention. But the real revolution was not in the ink on the page. It was in what this book represented. For centuries, access to the Bible was controlled by the church. Priests interpreted it, monks preserved it, and the ordinary believer had little chance of ever reading it themselves. Gutenberg's Bible shattered that monopoly. Soon, other printers across Europe began producing their own versions, in Latin and eventually in local languages. Suddenly, ordinary men and women could hold the sacred text in their own hands, read it, and interpret it without the filter of authority. This single shift lit the fuse of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's words, once nailed to a church door, spread like wildfire through pamphlets and books that could now be mass-produced. Ideas of reform, freedom, and personal interpretation of faith were impossible to contain. For the first time in history, the Word of God was not only spoken by priests, it was printed, multiplied, and shared across continents. The printing press didn't just spread religion, it transformed it. The printing press did not stop with the Bible. Once people saw what was possible, a flood of new texts appeared. History, philosophy, poetry, science, and stories began to spread. Books became cheaper and more available, and this began to change society in a fundamental way: literacy. Where once reading was the privilege of a tiny elite, now merchants, artisans, and even farmers' children began to learn letters. Schools expanded, teachers multiplied, and the idea of education as a path to empowerment took root. Reading became a form of independence, the ability to explore ideas on your own without relying solely on authority figures. Imagine the thrill of holding your first book, of entering a world of stories and knowledge previously denied to you. Imagine the empowerment of realizing that knowledge was no longer limited to a chosen few, but could belong to anyone willing to learn. This was the true revolution, the democratization of knowledge. The printing press became a great equalizer. It broke down barriers between the educated and the uneducated, the powerful and the powerless. And with every new reader, society changed. The world was no longer a place where truth was handed down from above, it was a place where truth could be discovered, debated, and shared by the many. If religion was the first revolution sparked by the printing press, science was the second. Before printing, scientific knowledge moved at a snail's pace. Manuscripts were copied by hand, filled with errors, and circulated in tiny circles. A discovery made in one part of Europe might take decades to reach another. But after Gutenberg, everything accelerated. When Copernicus published his groundbreaking work suggesting that the Earth revolved around the Sun, his ideas reached readers far and wide. Galileo's discoveries, Newton's theories, Kepler's laws, all spread faster and more widely because of the press. Scholars could now build on each other's work instead of reinventing the wheel. The printing press became the engine of the scientific revolution. It allowed diagrams, charts, and complex ideas to be reproduced accurately, ensuring that knowledge was not just preserved, but improved upon. Universities flourished, collaborations grew, and the spirit of inquiry spread. The greatest gift of the printing press to science was consistency. For the first time, experiments could be described in detail, printed, and replicated elsewhere. This gave birth to the modern scientific method, where knowledge could be tested, shared, and expanded. Without the printing press, the age of science as we know it would have been impossible. But the printing press did not only empower religion and science. It also became the weapon of politics and revolution. Pamphlets, newspapers, and manifestos began to circulate, spreading ideas of liberty, equality, and justice. Think of the American Revolution. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, printed and distributed in the thousands, stirred the hearts of colonists and helped ignite the fight for independence. Across the Atlantic, in France, revolutionary texts fanned the flames that brought down the monarchy. The Enlightenment, that age of reason and debate, was built on printed words. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu saw their ideas spread far beyond their salons, reaching ordinary people who demanded change. Political leaders realized that controlling the press meant controlling public opinion. For the first time in history, power was not only enforced by armies and kings, it was challenged by ideas printed on paper. The printing press gave people a voice. It allowed revolutions to speak, nations to form, and democracy to rise. In many ways, the modern political world was born on Gutenberg's press. The printing press was not just an invention. It was the beginning of something much larger, the global network of ideas. From Gutenberg's first Bible to today's digital libraries, the story of humanity has been one of increasing access to information. The press gave birth to newspapers, magazines, and eventually radio, television, and the internet. Each step along the way was built on Gutenberg's vision, that knowledge should be multiplied, shared, and made available to all. When we hold a smartphone and scroll through endless streams of text, images, and ideas, we are living in Gutenberg's legacy. His machine was the ancestor of the World Wide Web. His vision of democratized knowledge still echoes in our lives today. The printing press changed religion, science, politics, and culture. But most importantly, it changed us. It made us thinkers, dreamers, questioners, and creators. It gave us the tools to imagine a better world and the means to share that vision. So the next time you open a book or read an article online, remember the man who made it possible. Johannes Gutenberg did not simply invent a machine. He unlocked the human mind. He changed humanity forever.